Hi, Ida here. I have done some research into the archaeology of Southern Scandinavia, basically as a part of my ancestor work, but also because I'm a nerd and I think that is extremely interesting. But I also thought that it could be a good idea to share some of the things that I've learned, because I know that there are a lot of people around the world with some Scandinavian ancestry. Either you have some Viking ancestor from about 1,000 years ago, or you could have some great-great-granddad who came from Sweden to America in the mid-1800s, when Sweden was very poor and there were several really bad years in a short time, and a lot of people starved and really had no other choice than leaving. And so at that time, in the mid-1800s, I know a lot of people, especially from the south of Sweden, left, and they left to different parts of Europe. A lot of them left to America, places like Minnesota, for example. Of course, they'd heard the stories about the American dream. Other people left for South America, and some, I think, even went to Australia. And yeah, some of them managed to build up a new life there, a good life for themselves, but others, had to keep struggling and also had to deal with, missing the old country and homesickness, and yeah, that kind of problems. If you're interested, if you know that you have some kind of great-great-grandparents who came to the Americas from Sweden during that time, actually, you might be interested in reading a book. Actually, it's 4 books. It's a series by Swedish author Vilhelm Moberg. It's been translated to English. It's called The Emigrants. In English, it was published between 1949 and 1959, and it's about this family that, because they see no future in Sweden anymore, because it's just poor and life is just hard, and they hear about how great it is in America. They leave everything behind and move to I think it's to Minnesota, actually. And I think these books are considered to be fairly realistic description of what that was actually like for those immigrants from Sweden at that time. But that's not really what I was going to talk about today, because today I was going to talk about something much longer ago. I wanted to talk about life in Scandinavia about 7,000 years ago. So that's what I'll do. And so there were of course no written records back then, so this is all based on archaeology from southern Sweden and from Denmark particularly. Those are the areas that I've been looking into, because that's what's most relevant to me, I think. And it seems like people back then, they would for the most part live close to the water, but also sorry about that, seasonally perhaps also live a bit further inland, possibly having bigger gatherings during the winter with people from more settlements coming together. But anyway, because living near water would have been the best, really, because then you would have access to drinking water, you would have access to all the food that's in the water, like fish. We know, for instance, that people would eat pike back then. Also, you know, seafowl. We know that people would hunt swan, different kinds of birds, seagulls. We know they hunted eagles too, for instance. But we also know that in this area that I'm talking about now, there would have also been very close, if you live by the sea, you would have also had really good forests nearby too, with the kind of environment that wasn't that was rich in food. These forests that weren't too dense, but had a lot of undergrowth, which attracted you know, the animals you wanted to hunt. We know they hunted for elk, they hunted for deer, they hunted for wild boar. We also know they hunted wolf, and also like animals that lived close to the water, like seal and otters. We know they hunted too. So and of course they would eat herbs and things that would grow there. It's more difficult to know what people ate, the vegetable parts that they ate, because plant matter doesn't preserve as well. So we have to sort of extrapolate that based on what we know grew in the area. One thing we do know is that they ate hazelnut, because we found hazelnut shells. And I say we as if I dug them up myself, of course, I'm not an archaeologist. And that makes sense, because hazelnuts is very good food. You can preserve them over winter when there might not be a lot of other types of food, and they are very rich in energy, so it's very good food. Some chocolate. I'm a bit of a chocoholic. So that's what people ate. And as for tools, we know, of course, that they had stone tools. 7,000 years ago, this was in the Mesolithic era, i.e. the Stone Age. This is when people were hunter-gatherers, obviously. This is before agriculture came to this part of the world. But we had stone tools, both flint and other types of rock was also used for axes, for instance. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I told you, this is my second take of this video, because the first time I kept getting interrupted, and apparently even though I took a long break doing other things and things seem to have calmed down, I keep getting interrupted. Really bloody annoying. Yeah, so anyhow, but they had other materials too, of course. We know they used bone, they used antler, they had pottery, so they had, like, for pots and bowls, and for lamps they used pottery. Hide, and tools they used were things like spears, hooks, bow and arrow they had at this time. And also we see structures that seem to have been used for, like, drying food, or for preparing hide for use, for instance. And we have seen, like, what seems to have been the foundations for huts that they could have lived in. We've found these huge piles of waste, which of course we've learned a lot from what they threw away. We can extrapolate what they ate and what they used from that. What else? Textiles we found from that time. Again, textiles is something that is very rarely preserved, but because people lived close to the water, and these things later on were covered by water, so then they have been more better preserved. So that's why we know they had, we know what kind of textiles they used. They were made by plant fiber. I don't know what kind of plant fiber they actually used. I know that later on people used things like flax, but also like stinging nettle has been used for plant fiber for textile. So they used whatever was growing around. They found boats made of logs, and they have actually found like hearths, like for fire in the boats, which is interesting. They probably used sand or something as insulation, so the boat wasn't damaged, and they could have a fire on their boat if they wanted to. And they found paddles and oars for those boats, and they were richly decorated. So we also know that they cared about the aesthetics of things too. It was not just, you know, things being practical. They wanted things to be pretty too, and it could have been, you know, symbolic value or ritual or whatever. We don't know that. Found graves, of course, and archaeologists love graves because you can learn a lot from them. The graves at this time, they contained grave goods. They contained tools. They contained jewelry, such as pearls made from animal teeth. And again, this is the same animals that were hunted, like boar, elk, seal, deer, and so on. They found remnants of food. They found remnants of bones from these same animals too. And something that I think is very interesting is that they found dogs in those graves, but they also found burials that were apparently for the dogs, where there's no human in the grave. There's just a dog, and it's been treated in a similar way to human remains in human graves, that they've had some grave goods with them, some tools. So apparently people really appreciated their dogs back then, and presumably what the dogs did, the role the dog had, would have been for helping in the hunt, and as, you know, for raising the alarm if there were intruders, for instance. But it's nice to see that even as far back as 7,000 years ago, the dog was seen as probably as a companion, or as something that was very highly valued. What else? Yeah. There was something more I thought I wanted to say about the... Oh yeah, I have notes, but I'm really lousy with you know, referring to notes as I talk. But the other thing that I was going to say was red ochre was used in these graves on the remains of people, but also on the remains of the dogs. And that is very interesting, because red ochre is something that you found in graves pretty much throughout human history. You found red ochre in the oldest human graves you found, like going back, I don't know, 200,000 years ago. And there has been this huge of red ochre continually up until present day. I think there are still peoples, some places, that use red ochre for various ritual reasons, and what we've seen is, because that is what is preserved in archaeology, is that it's used in the graves. And graves are interesting for a lot of reasons. You can study the skeletons and see what's and learn a lot from that. I think I'll get back to that later. But also the fact that there are graves and that there are grave goods, and you can see that the graves are uniform in some way. That sort of implies that there's special rituals or rites that's connected to the whole burying people things, and that in turn implies that there is some kind of religion or some kind of spiritual idea. And it shows that if there are rituals for burying people, there are probably rituals for other things too. So these are people that have some kind of religion or spirituality, and where rituals have a place in their lives. And they were very dependent on nature, of course. They lived in and of nature in a much more direct way than we do. So, and that's also very interesting. You can see that how they choose where they live is very important. They have chosen the best locations. They have chosen the locations where they have the best access to the resources, like water and food and material. They don't just go and live anywhere. They live where it's the best place to live. And also it has to do with water. Being close to water is also a matter of traveling. It's difficult to travel through woodland, which is what you have around here at that time. It's much easier to travel over water. So that's also a reason for being near water. Another thing that I think can be interesting to know is that the landscape changed a lot at this time, because this is just a few thousand years after the last ice age. And during this time you have a situation where the sea level is rising, and it's rising quite rapidly, which means that when you want to live close to water, you're going to have to move your settlement every few generations, because the sea is sort of eating the land. So you lived in this sort of very changing world. What else can I say? In terms of social structures, there's always, you can only say so much about that, because social structures and values and ideas they aren't preserved in archaeology per se. You can just see sort of the traces of them in the material culture. But it seems to be that these settlements, they contained of groups of families, and as I said before, these groups probably joined up with other groups into larger gatherings at times of year, and that was probably, you know, for celebrations, for trading, for marriages. You need, if you live in these fairly small groups, we're talking about perhaps 40 to 80 people, you need to find your partner from somewhere else. And we know that there was trading. We know that there were contacts between people around here and people in continental Europe. And I'm going to say something that actually goes back further in history, but I think it's a very interesting point. And it's that there's a theory that says that one of the reasons probably, one of the reasons probably that our species, Homo sapiens, the modern human, was successful when the Neanderthals in Europe failed and went extinct, is that Homo sapiens was so good at these sort of, we were good at networking. we had these contacts between different groups, and over fairly long distances we got together and sort of could have this genetic exchange through marriage, and we could trade and cooperate in a way that it appears that Neanderthals didn't do. I mean, this is much earlier in history, so but I think it's an interesting point that the reason we're here today is probably that we were really good at networking. Because if you're living in very small groups and you're basically isolated, you become very vulnerable if something happens. Whereas if you have regular contact with other groups, and something happens, you can get help. You can help each other in a much more efficient way. But anyway, back to 7,000 years ago. One thing that we've seen is that the graves, though that they have some things in common, there are also differences. So it seems to be a situation where people are different. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that some people are considered to be better than others. It doesn't have to mean that some people had more power than others, but more perhaps that people had different roles in society. But you can also see that over time the practices changed, which is also very interesting, because we tend to think about the distant past as something that was static, and in fact it isn't. We see cultural changes. We can see changes in how they decorated the pottery, but also the grave practices are also different. So this was a culture that went through changes, just as our culture does today. And I think that is very important to remember, that even though they lived such a long ago, and even though their lifestyles were very different from ours, they're still basically like us. There are no huge differences. They are people just like us. They're not primitive. They just have a different kind of lifestyle. What else can I say? Yeah, in terms of life expectancy, the graves that we find in this area for that time, it seems that the life expectancy seems to have been about 45 years for men and 40 for women, but a lot of children died before the age of 5. And it seems to be like, if you survived early childhood, if you're a woman and you managed to survive childbirth, and you managed to avoid serious injuries through accidents, you could probably live for a pretty long time, because we found graves with people that are 60, 70 and even older too. But you have these particular dangers that kills a lot of people. And interestingly enough, it seems like people didn't starve. The groups were they weren't bigger than that the environment could sustain them, which is interesting, because we tend to think that in the past, people would starve, but that came later. That seemed to have appeared with agriculture, which was a whole different kind of lifestyle, and that seems to be when the whole problem with starvation started. So for hunter-gatherers in this part of the world at that time, they seem to have had enough food. They also seem to have had a fairly good diet. It seems to have been very varied. They don't seem to have any deficiencies caused by bad diet. What they did have was intestinal parasites, which of course could cause you know, various illnesses and deficiencies. Another thing that they didn't have apparently is a lot of these sort of epidemic infectious diseases that has killed a lot of people throughout history later on. The whole thing with epidemics seemed to have also been something that came with population explosion as a result of agriculture. Before that, when people were hunter-gatherers, they were simply too few and too far between for these infectious diseases to take hold. If you got an infection, that would have been because you had some kind of injury. You can get an infection in that, and of course you could die from that, but you didn't die from the flu in that same way as people did later on, or the plague. It's been theorized that there was less violence, and I personally think that is correct, because to me it makes sense. There would still have been conflicts, of course, so there would still have been person-to-person violence. This was not some kind of, utopia when no one ever killed anyone else. But it seems to have been, the violence it seems to have been small scale. And if you think about it, think about the lifestyle that they had. There's really no incentive for large scale violence, or a lot of violence in general. As hunter-gatherers, even if you have a fairly sedentary lifestyle, you only have so many possessions. You don't have the same kind of storages of food as you would have to have if you're a farmer. And I magically changed clothes, because once again I was interrupted by an airplane, and while I was waiting for that to go away, I had a sip of chocolate and poured the whole thing on me. So yeah, I'm green now. Where was I? Yeah, you don't have the same amount of accumulated wealth if you're a hunter-gatherer. Also, as I said, it seems like people had the amount of food and the amount of resources they needed, so there's no real competition for food and resources. And then, I mean, what are you going to fight over? You cannot agree, and you can get annoyed with each other, but there's no incentive for large-scale violence, because people are so few and far between too. You don't probably won't be fighting too much over territory. And also you've seen this amongst modern hunter-gatherers that live in a lifestyle that seems to be similar to this sort of ancient hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that they avoid violence. Because if you live in a small group, killing each other is going to be a huge problem. You don't want that. You need to try to solve your problems in another way, and usually through conversation and communication. You've seen that with modern hunter-gatherers. So that seems to be the case 7,000 years ago too. And I think communication in general was very very important, both because when you were these small groups, you would have had to cooperate. But also, I mean, think about the things that they were doing. They weren't cooped up in front of a computer. They might, nowadays, even if you have a lot of people around you, everyone is, busy with their own computer. Back then, what would they be doing? They would be hunting or gathering food or setting traps, or they would be doing pottery or cooking or weaving or what else? Working, the skins, the hides of animals, or all these things. And these are all things that lend themselves very well to social interaction. You can do that and talk to each other at the same time, tell stories, gossip, sing. So I think they would have spent a lot of time together and conversing and chatting. It seems. And also, as for leadership, judging both on the graves, but also on studies of more modern hunter-gatherers with similar lifestyles, it seems that they didn't have this kind of hierarchy. They didn't have a kind of a central leadership that was inherited. It seems to have been more a matter of listening to the experts. Like, you became a leader because you had proven that what you said was valuable. Like, you had a lot of life experience, for instance. People would, it would make sense to listen to you. Or if you were a great hunter, it would make sense for you to take a leading role when it came to issues about hunting. If you were an expert on healing plants, you would take a leading role when it came to healing. Perhaps it seems to have leadership seems to have been more fluid and more sort of based on your role and on your competence. It wasn't just one leader, but whoever was the best on this particular thing, on this particular activity, was the leader when it came to issues revolving that activity. That was a silent airplane. I'm not going to turn off the camera for that. So there was this sort of activity-led leadership instead. And yeah, I think it's important. It kind of the way I'm presenting this now, it kind of sounds like I'm romanticizing, and I think it's important not to do that. I mean, there's a reason. The average life expectancy was 40 to 45 years. People died early, and so it's important to remember that life wasn't necessarily easy or comfortable, but it also wasn't all bad, just as there are good things and bad things with our modern lifestyle, and that lifestyle wasn't necessarily worse than now. I don't think I would have preferred to live in the Stone Age, but I think it's more a matter of lifestyles being different rather than one being superior to the other, because there were good or bad then, and there is good and bad. Now, you know, they faced, you know, a certain types of problem. We face other problems. But yeah, I hope you found this interesting. As I said, I'm a nerd, so I find this immensely interesting, but I also understand that maybe not everyone does. But if you like it, please let me know. Please subscribe. Thank you for watching.